Welcome back, everyone. I'm going to finish up a little bit on the example I gave last week on the settlement, and I've used Philadelphia as an example. This example could probably be adjusted for almost anywhere you can think of, where land was once unsettled and people moved in gradually. And normally the process is pretty much the same when you think about it. People come in and their first task is to really support themselves agriculturally, um, hunting, gathering, then horticulture, and then agriculture, domestication of animals. All that kind of follows in a pretty steady line. So this is an early map of Philadelphia that I showed you last week, and the Delaware River is the main artery that links Philadelphia with the Atlantic Ocean and points north. And so the city grew from that beginning, from the settlement right there at the shore of the Delaware River. There's also another river. If you go about less than a mile inland, you run into the Schuylkill River, and the Schuylkill River runs eventually all the way down into Maryland and up to New York area. But it was another one of the navigable arteries that linked Philadelphia with the interior. So in the early stages, a lot of goods, agricultural goods that were being produced in the more western part of the colonial period would find their way to the Schuylkill River and eventually would find trade routes there. And again, William Penn, if you remember from last week, was the architect of all this. And Penn, in a very real sense, I said, was a visionary, and he was ahead of his time. He understood the value of land over time and what to do to increase the value of land. When he got here, land was abundant. It was extremely affordable. The settlement of the vast North American coast regions provided real opportunities for a better life for the sons and daughters of European farming families that were unable to divide their land holdings in the old world. I mean, at some point, you just don't have enough land to support a growing family and additional generations. So middle class, or at least yeoman farmers who did have title to land in the old world were selling off their land and acquiring much more acreage in the new world. And the Philadelphia region was a prime area where they came. So with this happy circumstance of the availability of free or very cheap land, inexpensive land to come to and become self-sufficient, the question that we have in this course is how long this happy circumstance would continue. So I showed you this picture last week, and I think it was the last one I showed you. This is Philadelphia in 1906, and it had grown enormously. After the Civil War, the war between the states, whichever term you want to choose, this Dock Street section became the city's principal food market. So agricultural commodities were coming in from the rest of Pennsylvania and elsewhere, and they were coming in on ship. The goods that were not being produced and grown in the United States or in a Pennsylvania market, just think of things like bananas and anything that would be grown in a tropical environment were coming in, and they were being resold here at the Dock Street area in Philadelphia, just as this kind of a market area grew up in every city and town that you can think of. Right. So always with increased population came changing land uses and generally rising land values. So you have market forces that are capitalizing the rental value of land into a selling price. And that's the concept. We'll talk more about that. It's not that difficult to understand. You just think about it. If you hold a piece of land that someone will pay you $1,000 a year to rent, to lease, and the rate of interest in the marketplace, the either for investments, returns on investments, if you think an acceptable rate of return on your investment is, say, 5%, so you just do a little calculation, $1,000 a year divided by 5%, that means that 20 times 1,000 or $20,000 would be probably the minimum acceptable selling price for that parcel of land. If you're optimistic that the rental values are going to continue to increase year after year after year, and you're not in a position where you need the money, then you're going to hold out for more. You might say, okay, the current selling price for this land or value is $20,000, but if you want it from me now, you're going to have to pay me a premium over what the current market is, because I know that every year that goes by, it's going to increase in value, and eventually it may double or triple in price. Anybody have any questions about that, particularly those of you who've not taken a similar course here at the school of market capitalization? Same, it basically works with any asset that yields, some sort of income stream, and that's a basic idea of what gives value to assets. As this is a photograph of one of the streets in Philadelphia, where one of the older buildings is constructed, and by comparison to Europe or some other places around the world, the structures in Philadelphia, even the oldest, aren't that old in comparison. But for North America, this is one of the oldest cities with still a fairly substantial area in the central city that still has a good number of original buildings. Well, as people come together to compete with one another for the best locations, whether for commerce in the cities, for residents, or to grow agricultural crops in the outskirts, the demand for land is going to increase. So with minor exceptions, every parcel or tract of land eventually comes to have a rental value. What that means is you might acquire the land free because there's so much of it available, and there are still only a small number of people who are coming into the region looking for land to settle on, looking for land to produce on. And so for a while, the land might be, you might be able to access it for free. In the United States, there have been any number over the history of the country, even in colonial times, where land was given away free. And in fact, there are a few places in the United States where communities are so desperate to bring back population that they're offering land for free. If you come and you commit to build up a house and stay there for X number of years, they will give you a free parcel of land. They might even give you a tax exemption for a certain period of years in order to encourage people to come back. That's not the case in Philadelphia, except for some of the most distressed neighborhoods. And for those of you from the outside of the United States, and you may be already familiar with this, you have the same experience in your own countries, there are neighborhoods in our cities that go through periods of boom and bust. Even as Philadelphia was growing, there were parts of the city that were going through periods of bust after a boom for any number of reasons. It may be because that area was once residential and it soon became more industrial, and people who could afford to do so left because they wanted to get away from the pollution, from the dirt and the grime. They wanted to get away from workers, and they created new neighborhoods with bigger and better housing, but away from the work-a-day part of the city that was no longer acceptable to them. So you see all these kinds of changing land uses. Sometimes with increased land values, sometimes with diminished land values because of the way the land was treated. Pollution does that, of course. There are brownfields scattered all around the United States. What's a brownfield? A brownfield is a place where production once occurred, normally industrial production. There was a lot of use of pollutant chemicals. Those chemicals were dumped in streams or buried in the ground, and that land is really difficult to make a second use of unless it's remediated, which is extremely expensive. So all across the United States, at least, and I would expect elsewhere in the world, there are all these projects for land remediation, either capping it or digging out the pollutants and actually hauling them away to someplace else that's less desirable for people to use. But the rents may go up and they'll go down based on the circumstances. But once most of the land is claimed, then rents are generally going to go up. There's not going to be any free land left under normal circumstances. So again, looking at Philadelphia, here's another photograph of Philadelphia. Penn's design was for what he called a green country town, but it was soon overwhelmed by population increase and the changing highest best use of locations. Another dynamic was that more and more land was acquired not for development of homes or businesses, but purely for speculation. And that issue will come up in our discussions in a little bit. So land had almost from the beginning taken on the character of a commodity rather than an essential part of the commons to be shared by all in the community. Once you issue a deed to someone, giving them legal title or control over a parcel of land, the question is, what are conditions attached? What conditions are attached to that deed? Does the owner of the holder of the deed holder or landowner, have any responsibility to the community? One responsibility probably is to pay some sort of annual tax on the land that's held. There may be other responsibilities as to how that land can be used. And to the extent there are restrictions on the owner as to how the land can be used, that may affect its annual rental value. I'll give you a quick idea of what I mean here. If I own a giant parcel of land in the city, and the city says to me, you can produce anything you wish on this land, but you must create no pollution. There must be nothing harmful coming out of your furnaces, your building. There must be no pollution. Zero pollution is permitted. So as a person looking to generate revenue and profit from the ownership of this land, I have to take in mind a calculation. How much can I afford to pay either in taxes to the community, or if I'm going to lease this land perhaps from another landowner, how much can I afford to pay and still earn a profit? So if my cost of doing business is very high because of all the restrictions that are placed on what I can do, then my ability to pay rent or pay the community a high rent would be greatly diminished. The real rental value of that lot, that parcel of land, would have to come way down. And the community would have to recognize that. It's a trade-off. If the community says to me, all right, Ed, you can do whatever you want on this land. There's no responsibility for controlling pollution or whatever you want to do, you just do. Then I don't have that cost. There's no cost imposed on me to alter my activities based on concerns about this negative output. So I would be able to and willing to pay a higher rent, whether it is to the community directly in the form of taxation or to a landowner who wants to lease the land to me. that's a fairly important observation. So I want you to think about it a second. And does anyone not get that, or you have a question or concern about the points I'm trying to make here? All right. Since it's quiet, I'll go on. Um, excuse me for just a sec. So, as I've stated, population growth leads to changing land uses. Agricultural land is converted to business and residential use. Then land parcels are divided and divided again to accommodate more buildings. Initially in Philadelphia, the parcels of land for residences were fairly large and had big yards, enough for a produce garden in the back. People were growing their own food. Over time, the design that William Penn set out was compromised. Lots were divided in half, and now you had, more narrow, what we call in the United States, alleyways, between the buildings that were often the places where all the rubbish was thrown, and trash and where pollutants were thrown out of windows or whatever, until Benjamin Franklin came along and organized sanitation efforts in Philadelphia. And the same process has gone on all across the world when cities are developing. Some more or less successful than others. Then you think about, in addition to lots being divided, you have wholesale changes where buildings are torn down and replaced. And with the appearance of a steel girder construction technique and then elevators, buildings began to rise ever higher and higher. So you no longer have, you take a look at the building on the right here, Penn Hotel, it's 1, 2, 3, 4-story walk up. And that, eventually that land use, that building becomes inefficient, and the market is going to demand, based on rising land values, that building be torn down and replaced, unless it's given some sort of a historic designation and protected by that kind of protection. Then buildings get more reliable heating systems and air conditioning. Heating opened up construction in the climates that are cold in the winter, very cold in the winter. Air conditioning opened up regions in the South where the temperatures are consistently high for most of the year. So those technologies really increase the potential for construction to occur, the attraction of population, and the increase in land values. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to treat you to a little bit of an experiment. I want you to think with me about the basis for forming a new society. Think about how to best achieve a just allocation of land so that there's equality of opportunity for everyone in the community. And I pull this quote from Thomas Paine on this issue. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. And we still have that power if we just come up with ideas that address some of the most serious problems in our societies that are related to our use and abuse of nature and of the land. And Paine had some interesting ideas on this subject too, that I think he learned from reading the physiocrats and perhaps a bit from Adam Smith. But Thomas Paine wrote a tract titled Agrarian Justice that I would refer to you as good reading even today. So let's start from the beginning. Let's assume we are a community of farmers living somewhere in the old world. By the old world, I mean Europe and Eurasia. Our lands are losing fertility. Our leadership is oppressive, takes in rents and taxes much of what we produce. New laws are allowing the commons to be enclosed so that we can no longer gather wood or graze our animals. Moreover, we're fearful of invasion by armies sent by neighboring princes seeking to add to their own territory. So we decide to leave our homeland to establish an independent society somewhere in the New World. So we send a small group ahead to locate and survey an area for settlement. And this happens to be North America. Yeah. For Anthony, it's Australia or New Zealand, and for others, it could be the southern tip of Africa or any other parts of the world. So this is what we're facing. We have an area that we're coming to, and our surveyors, along with us, help us to decide on how to fairly allocate the land by coming up with a sketch. They do a survey and they tell us, okay, here's what the region looks like. We have a river running through it. On each side of the river, for the most part, the land is pretty fertile. And toward the southwestern part of the river, there's swampland, and it's not going to be good for much. And then we have this other river flowing into the main river, but from another direction. And on both sides of that river, the land is heavily wooded. It might also be less flat. So the land along the main river on each side is fairly level. And so it's going to be easy to clear and plant crops and to begin agriculture. Okay. So what we're going to say is that everyone needs a minimum of 60 units of wealth, that is production, in order to have a subsistence life. Okay. And so that's the minimum amount of land that would be allocated to everyone. The person who doesn't know how to farm might decide to exchange to allow another farmer to farm his or her land in exchange for some other services that they would provide. But they need to get at least 60 units of wealth. The colonists talk about this and they say, okay, there's plenty of land, we think, that we're going to give everyone enough land to produce not 60, but 100 units of wealth each year, which will permit a standard of well-being that's considerably higher, and certainly probably higher than any of them enjoyed back in the old country. So that's a starting point where now those 10 families are going to allocate all this land at that point in time, so that everyone has the potential, either directly or indirectly, to experience a living based on getting 100 units of wealth, which they can then, once they have that wealth, it can be bartered, exchanged, whatever, for other goods and services. So here's how they would do it. They should do it. The answer is to allocate different size plots of land to each colonist based on estimates of the potential wealth production using like inputs of labor and capital goods. This is one of the in Henry George's analysis, this is a point he makes very specifically, that we want to gauge average production out of a common input of labor and capital goods. Some people might be less efficient, and some people might be more efficient. So there's not enough highly fertile land with direct access to the rivers. But on the other hand, the heavily wooded areas could compensate by creating opportunities for specialization. So maybe you will run out of all the land along the rivers, but we'll be able to give people plots of land in the heavily wooded areas that might be less than the same plots that are fertile, but maybe will be able to generate a lot more wealth because of the fact that it has these natural resources. So some members of the community would plant crops, others would harvest timber, and others would get other plants from the forest. An equitable division of the land would then set the stage for a more advanced system of wealth production stimulated by trade and commerce, at least for a time. And that's the important factor here. They've created a new society with the best type of law associated with settlement of land and use of land. But how long will it last, even under those ideal conditions? That's the question that now comes up. So the long-term outcome would depend on whether equality of opportunity could be maintained as the population of the community increased and as land uses began to change with the development of a town, with the depletion of soil fertility, the clearing of forests, the increased need for access to water, and all the other issues that arise with an increase in population density. Now, I created this out of nothing. So the problem with William Penn's plan is that it was not based on a high level of equality of opportunity, because the Penn family and the Penn proprietors carved out special rights for themselves, or special privileges for themselves. So what happens? What happens when Europeans arrived to settle in our hypothetical region? Well, here's a rough map of Philadelphia again, and where it was established. And the Penn proprietors, the Penn family, were astute enough to make sure that even though they might offer some land free or very inexpensive, they held on to the parcels of land that were potentially going to become more and more valuable over time, yield greater and greater rents to them, even as they were not producing anything themselves on the land. So just to apply this directly to the Philadelphia story, we know that Philadelphia grew, and some grew rich, and others had a much more difficult time making their way even in Philadelphia as the city grew. And that is because of the land question. And in political economy, we're going to deal with, in the next lecture, the laws that govern the distribution of wealth. Back to the factors of production: rent to land, wages to labor, and we can use interest as a term, or capital yield back to capital goods. The use of the term interest has been, from the very beginning of political economy, extremely controversial, because of its common day use. And even with rent, people don't really get it all the time. When you mention the word rent, people automatically think of what you pay to live in an apartment or lease a house from somebody. So hopefully we're going to be able to solve some of these issues as we go through the laws of production and distribution. Let me get back to what I think Henry George accomplished. He brought his intellectual and analytical skills to this challenge of explaining the processes by which wealth is produced and then distributed back to these three factors of production: rent to land, wages to labor, and interest or capital yield to capital. And again, remember that in his analysis, only tangible goods are capital. He's talking about capital goods. So finance is something very different. It's an externality in his system. And there are certain laws, natural laws, that George identifies that determine the relationship and determine the outcome. But those are laws of tendency, he says. And I wish he had spent a little bit more time in his writing talking about about the laws of wealth production and distribution as laws of tendency, because the laws are subject to all these externalities that you can think of. Government being a major externality. And so laws regarding taxation, laws regarding how nature can be utilized, laws regarding the conditions under which labor can be employed, under which capital goods can be employed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're all powerful externalities. And so when you do the analysis of what's happening, you have to say, all right, what are the most powerful externalities at work? And are those externalities advancing the production and distribution of wealth as they ought to, or are they thwarting the production and distribution of wealth as they ought to? I found an interesting quote from Noam Chomsky on this issue. And he wrote, "If you're in a system where you must make a profit in order to survive, you are compelled to ignore negative externalities, effects on others." And that's kind of consistent with the point that I was making earlier about whether or not you have the ability under the law to do with it whatever you want on the land that you have, you hold without restriction, or if you have serious restrictions on what you can do, how that's going to affect your willingness and ability to either pay the community a certain level of rent, and that level of rent will be adjusted based on market conditions and what you can afford to pay to the community, subject to your need to get a decent return on your labor and capital goods. Okay, so back to the history of political economy. It was this fellow who started the argument and the discussion in a serious way. It was David Ricardo, who was a stock investor and a financier in England, who made the first attempt to apply scientific observation to how land is chosen for development. His focus was on agriculture and the differences in natural fertility. And this is what he left to people like Henry George to think about. He wrote, "After all, the fertile land in the immediate neighborhood of the first settlers were cultivated. If capital and population increased, more food would be required, and it could only be procured from land not so advantageously situated." So, you're going to have to go to the second level of potentially productive land in order to meet the consumption needs of a growing population. He goes on, he says, "Thus, by bringing successively land of a worse quality or less favorably situated into cultivation, rent would rise on the land previously cultivated." And that's really where Ricardo ends. He makes no moral judgment about this whole process. He says that this is descriptive, it's not prescriptive. He'll leave it to others, Adam Smith for one, Turgot for another, Paine for another, and eventually Henry George. So George extends Ricardo's analysis well beyond a treatment of agricultural land and applies it to locations in cities and towns and to all that George came to describe as, quote, natural opportunities or natural monopolies. The definition of rent Henry George came to was rather simple. He writes, "Rent is that portion of production or wealth claimed in return for access to land when land of equal quality is no longer freely available." Pretty simple. As long as land, that hypothetical I gave you, the land was freely available, at least to those first 10 families, and maybe there's a total of, who knows, 100 people. But at some point, the land that was able to produce that 100 units of wealth that they wanted everyone to have access to would now require larger and larger parcels of land in the hinterland because it was less and less productive, given the technology of the time. Now, of course, I wish my forefathers had invested a lot of money in, land somewhere in the North America where the sun shines 365 days a year or the wind blows 365 days a year. Might not have been good for anything else, but I'd be a very wealthy person today, so long as the communities that governed that particular territory did not have a system to keep track of the increasing rental value of the land that was used for solar and wind farms. So George goes the next step. He went further, introducing to readers the concept of the margin of production. He says, rent is determined by the margin of production. That is, rent equals the amount of produce in excess of what could be produced from the poorest land in use with the same amount of labor and capital. And that's again his provision. So this is, average production using the same amount of labor and capital. So if you're more efficient, you're still going to pay the same rent. You should not be penalized by your efficiency. The amount of rent that you would pay to the community under George's scheme would be determined by this margin of production. So note that it's descriptive. This definition is descriptive at this point. He will later in his analysis add his moral judgments with regard to laws and policies by which rent is redirected from a community or society to private individuals and private entities. All right, remember that hypothetical community, that ideal community that I tried to establish earlier? We can now try to take a look at what happens to the initial relative level of equality of opportunity existing in the early period of settlement, given the changes that occur when population increases, et cetera. So bear with me. I'm gonna take you on another little journey with this analysis. So assume again you have subsistence living requiring 60 units of wealth. A generation after the city is established, the same size land parcel, now used for commerce rather than agriculture, will yield 300 units of wealth. And that that wealth is now acquired not by growing food, but by exchange of goods and services. There's no longer any land in the city that can be settled on for free. So we're going to look at this process through a couple of simple graphs that I've put together, and hopefully they're understandable. Bear with me. Okay, so in the earliest stage of the settlement, when all the land is freely accessible, the best locations will again yield 100 units of wealth. That's the total on the right. This is the entire yield then is wages. There's no rent being generated. There's no exchange value to the land at this point. So it's the entire yield is wages. That is the return to labor and interest to the extent capital goods are involved. So it's determined by the productivity of labor and the quality of the capital goods that are available at the time. Now, next, we look at the beginning of the rise of rent. When land yielding 100 units of wealth is fully occupied, the next best locations, still freely accessible, yield 90 units of wealth. Again, with the same input of labor and capital goods. Now, the best locations command rent of 10 units. And political economy describes the best freely accessible land as, again, the margin of production. I'm sure Mike Curtis is very familiar with these charts. Okay, so you go a little bit further in the future. When all land able to provide subsistence or greater production is fully occupied, the best locations now have an advantage equal to 40 units of output. These 40 units are what constitutes the rent attached to those locations. And producers can't afford to turn over more than 40 units of wealth as rent because 60 units, again, is the minimum required for subsistence. Only when labor productivity increases by the introduction of new forms of capital goods and new technologies will rents continue their upward climb. So as new technologies are introduced and as individuals learn how to use those technologies even more productive, so that for every unit of input of labor and capital goods, there's an increased output of wealth, then rents will climb. So getting back to our story, the rise of rent and this, how it can get beyond the level that is explained in a more simple environment. There's another way to show how these relationships change with time and population growth that I think might be a little clearer. Just think of how different life in Philadelphia must have been in 1876 from what it was like in 1776. One century is gone by. So we begin with this basic wealth pie. And I don't know who developed this method of teaching this particular part of Henry George's analysis, but I think it works pretty well. That you see here that when there's no rent yielded, when there's no capital goods being utilized, and people are producing wealth by going out with their hands and picking, fruits or whatever nature provides without tools, it's all wages. 100% of what they produce is their wages. And then, of course, again, as we learn new technologies and develop more efficient tools, the size of this wealth pie increases. And so long as there are no permanent settlements, wealth was distributed back to labor. It will be distributed back to labor as wages and to capital goods. So at a time when people were largely self-sufficient, working on the land and agriculture, this basic relationship was pretty clear. However, the modern economy, in which most people are employed by business entities and paid a monetary wage, obscures the fact that labor may be producing greater wealth, that is wages, than the worker is receiving in monetary compensation. But this just shows that, as at some point there is all wages and all interest because the land is not yet fully claimed and there's no margin of production. But again, that's not going to last all that much longer. So once land is settled, once communities are being built, whether land is issued to individuals and entities by lease or sold with a deed, you're now going to see this third characteristic come in. The rent will become a part of this pie. And it's a claim on the total wealth produced. It's not separate from, George is talking about this again, everything in that circle is tangible wealth. It's tangible goods. And rent is that portion of tangible goods that's being claimed by land as a factor of production, irregardless of who controls the land. So this is what this chart is basically showing you. Now, I'm going to end up pretty soon here, so we can have a few minutes for conversation. So for those individuals who acquire knowledge and skills necessary to effectively use the new forms of capital goods and ever more efficiently produce wealth wealth from nature, their actual standard of living will generally improve and has generally improved, even when the rising rent fund is captured by private interests rather than by the community or society to pay for needed and desired public goods and services. And if you think about societies, the United States, and certainly societies throughout most of the world today, there's a considerable portion of the population that has gained ownership of land. And in the United States, on the residential side, that's roughly 60 some percent of the households that have a deed to a parcel of land, or they have air rights in a condominium or a cooperative, association. And so they have a stake in the whole system. And as the land values increase, their net worth is likely to increase. Their paper net worth for most of the time, but once they decide or are forced to sell, then they're going to be able to gain from this system that's in place, because they are going to capture this capitalization of an unearned income stream in the form of rent. And so that's why we have a significant history of a growing, expanding middle class, not only in the United States and many other countries, but getting back to the original scenario, at some point, this is going to fall back on itself. We may be at that point or beyond that point here in the United States. There was an organization formed back in the, I guess, the early 90s called Redefining Progress. And they did an analysis of the standard of well-being of households in the United States. And they said their analysis showed that we peaked in the US about 1978. And from that point on, there has been a scale back, a declining standard of well-being in the distribution of income and wealth in the country for many reasons, but certainly the rising price of land and natural resources has contributed to that.